Freedom of Religion Foundation was dominated by a mother-daughter team, Ann Nicole and Ann Laurie Gaylor, women leaders. Strong women leaders in these movements. Yet they're probably the most difficult relating to getting a message across of a more positive image. And yet I find it's too bad because some of these folks were, and we met, who was here a couple meetings ago, Margaret Downey, an important woman leader in the Atheist Alliance International. And now she has a group in Philadelphia, a secular group. Woman leaders, strong. Yet we wonder if there's enough woman leadership in the humanist movement in general. We think there's a struggle there. So these groups we see as either being advocacies for their positions, which is fine, that's a good goal and I admire it. Or some of the people like the skeptics were challenging claims by what we would call pseudoscience or other questionable claims. So that you have different people claiming something. And it's up to the skeptics to test it to see. And you'll see magazines like Skeptical Inquirer and Skeptics as being, you know, the method. So that's another role that these groups play. So they are either advocacy or they are challenging claims from those that are not true scientifically oriented. So these are the things that exist out there, and there are many organizations with these groups. Now the other group that's very unusual is ethical culture. They didn't start out as a humanist group. They were not humanists historically. They were an idealistic group that Felix Adler started, where there was this transcendent entities, the ideal way the universe is organized into an ethical continuum, like a manifold. And it came out that if you obeyed nature's system and you followed these manifolds, you would be more ethical. And therefore you put together an ethical system which you can, if you know most ethical culture values, it's a lot like humanist values. When you get to the ethics and stuff, very similar. But the difference is that they think it comes from a philosopher's idea that the manifold is out there and humans pick it up. However, in the 60s, a group of ethical culture, that's what the people call leaders, they're like ministers, got together around 64 or 5 and said, well, you know, we're really humanists. We really base our ideas on the naturalistic universe, not any transcendent entity. So they were leaving Adler's position of idealism, it's called. Immanuel Kant was a philosopher who had an idealistic idea. I get the name. The ideals exist out there. While the humanist says, well, you know, we humans figure out what is the good way to be ethical and we function that way. And that's where they're going into the more naturalistic or materialistic concept of how the world works and how we relate to it. So now, when you get to humanism's philosophy, the Bible, the Second Testament is Paul Kurtz's writings. Those are the two. Corliss Lamont is like an earlier generation. He's the first, actually a good chunk of the 20th century. Paul Kurtz straddles late 20th century into the 21st century. Very similar philosophy. The different personalities, but the philosophies are almost the same. So what do we talk about with a philosophy? Now these other groups failed to show me a complete philosophy at all. None of them showed me. They showed me goals, and they showed me purposes, and they showed me values even, about how to take care of the secular individual in his life. But where is the rest of the philosophy? So what Corliss Lamont and Paul Kurtz both did was to describe what is philosophy, what do we mean by that? And believe me, when these two guys talk about philosophy, it's easy. It's not hard. I wish they could make science as easy as these two writers made philosophy. Think about all it takes. If I use a fancy word like metaphysics, just means, what's the nature of the universe? It's like, what's it all about, Alfie, right? What is it? What's it all about? Metaphysics is a fancy word for what is out there. And in here, what's out there? Metaphysics. Epistemology is how we find out about it. How do we go about understanding it? Fancy word. Notice they use these big words, metaphysics, and we can just say what is, and we can say learning, knowledge. That's good enough. Even that works. The only reason why the word logic is confusing, that's the next term that they talk about, is how in any way do you communicate these ideas? You put it together in a reasonable, rationalistic way so it makes sense. So logic is a formal version of taking what we've tried to understand, the nature of the universe and our place in it, and we try to bring the information to other people. So if you know something and you want this individual to know it, you got to get it from there to here. Paul Kurtz and Corliss Lamont did it through wonderful writings. But I think Corliss Lamont is the premier collection because it was in one organized piece. Paul Kurtz with a whole bunch of writings that was put together, but the philosophies are almost identical, the values and the things. So after you've done that, after you say, what is the nature of the universe and our place in it, and how do I communicate it? Well, the next thing we're going to talk about is values. What do we value? And there's two forms of valuing. There is ethical values, which means how am I going to react and behave and function in this piece of knowledge that I'm trying to understand, and how do I relate that to somebody? So that's the ethical portion of it. And how do we determine how to do this? How do we find out how to be ethical? And that's going to be some of the challenges that we will look here later. The table of contents is amazing in this book. It'll help a lot. Ethics. And the other thing is aesthetics. Corliss Lamont loves poetry. You read all the poems in here? He loves literary style, the beauty of language. He also loves the beauty of nature. 1949, here's a man talking about the importance of nature. How many people in 1949 were dealing with the importance of nature? Not even, well, this guy was hardly alive yet. Can you imagine that? I mean, now, you talk about ecology and the importance of nature. He's talking about it in 1949, the importance, the beauty of nature, the appreciation of nature, he calls it. So there's the aesthetics now. So therefore, he has done these things. He has taken the importance of, this is a philosophy, which I think I pointed out these other groups don't quite go that far. They don't put it together into a system like this. So humanists, and we don't have to even study a course in philosophy. The only courses I had in philosophy was in education, John Dewey's Philosophy of Education and Learning, which is important. And later on we get into pragmatism, but the important thing here was that you don't have to be a heavy-duty philosopher to understand these guys. In fact, both of these guys say, you have a philosophy whether you know it or not. You have a value system. Well, how do I think this is right? Or ask yourself how you know something. It isn't enough that he or she told me. You might go check something. How do we do this checking? So we're going to relate to that. Do you folks have a copy of this in front of you? Look at the table of contents. Table of contents almost gives you this. You don't even have to read the book. Is there more of them?
Everybody's checking it out. I like that scanning. That's good.
Now, do you notice the first meaning of humanism is the importance of philosophy? You notice what we're trying to talk about, why philosophy, and why I'm using humanism to have an edge over all these other groups? Do you see the advantage? I think it has. Remember, I am subject to intelligent disagreement. I need to hear that when I need to be disagreed with. But this is the importance of a philosophy. He defines, there are so many kinds of humanism in history. Go back to Renaissance humanism, and even looks at classic Greek. Technically, they were humanists, Socrates, Plato, and people like Epicurus is one of my favorite philosophers, were the real humanists, I feel. The Stoics were kind of that way, but they were too hung up on obeying the laws of nature like it was God, and that bothers me a little bit. But otherwise, I like them too. All right, so the different kinds of humanism. But if you get a chance to read this, just look at the different kinds. Renaissance humanism talks about the importance of the arts. After the Middle Ages was starting to be realized that, hey, we're past this now. So you look at Florence and that part of Italy where things starting to happen. Well, that's where some of these humanisms come out. All right, what he does too is a tradition. He has forerunners, and you can talk about people. But he shows that, by the way, whereas these other groups do a lot of religion bashing, you don't see Corliss Lamont religion bashing. He loves the sources that religion gives us. And I love Unitarian, and he gives a big plug for the Unitarians. And when you look at Manifesto 1, it was dominated by Unitarian ministers.
It was.
Manifesto 1. A bunch of Unitarian ministers. So, but look at what else he's got. He's got the free thought movement, ethical culture, on the extreme left of your thing. Various religions. They still have ethics. Religions still have ethics. You may be given those ethics through some divine revelation. He doesn't accept that part of the epistemology. But the values still are there. Philosophy, now, two philosophies I really like are naturalism and materialism. You notice how they kind of straddle the two edges there? Actually, in some advantages, materialism has some advantages over naturalism. What's the distinction? It's very fine. Naturalism allows any science to be a feeder to the system. That includes the social scientists as well as the natural sciences. Materialism is heavily natural scientists. That's the biggest difference. So that if I say what really exists in the universe with materialism, the stuff, air, stuff like that, and energy. With naturalism, does such a thing as love, memory, and compassion exist? Or are they human manifestations? So some naturalists are a little bit critical naturalists say, well, let's not throw that out the window. So you contemplate its impact on our life. But the naturalists hang on to it because they say, don't mess with me with my love. I love and it's part of my life. And so critical naturalists will say, well, love is important. No. Whereas the materialist says, well, love is a human manifestation. Any intelligent being manifestation. It's mostly human, but it might be among bonobos and other high-level creatures. So those two philosophies are very strong in its history. And I had the reason why I lean on materialism is because when you get into humanist, like we talk about the nature of the universe, even today, when the scientists are struggling with such things as dark energy and dark matter, that's a materialistic concept. It's dark, and they know that something happens. They can't see what's causing it, but they know something's happening. So you form an inference. The kind of use of reason, you form an inference as to what might be causing that to happen. In the case of sunlight bending around a powerful source, it's dark matter. But when the universe is expanding at a faster rate, that's called dark energy. They don't know what it is yet. And my scientific friend is going to try to tell us more about it in June, a theoretical physicist. So you notice what you have here. He has this section. He honors these sources, these other sources, obviously the scientific method. Very big on democratic government, very critical. And you got to remember, Corliss Lamont dealt with social and communism and Marxism in his study. He had to struggle with reconciling the idea of Marxism and democratic government. That was a struggle for him. Right, it had to have been, right? Because he wanted to help people in need, and a socialistic system would be a fair system. But there is a challenge we're going to touch on, if I have time, about human nature. So if Marxism says, okay, we will set this thing up, and we'll get things all set up so people can be taken care of, so no one will go hungry and all that, and it'll be set up so that eventually, listen to this phrase, and I need correction if I don't have it right, the state will wither away. Well, think about it. I'm holding a position of power, right? And I'm in charge. And, you know, those guys, that's an early Soviet system. Am I going to, I got to wither away? I'm going to give up my power so that it's going to wither away and it's going to become a truly popular, run by the workers? It's tough. So that part of human nature was a challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah, who's going to set the rules?
Say what?
Who's going to set the
That was the
and
challenge.
enforce the
Yeah.
rules?
And if you go back to the Marxian idea, they just have to give it up. Well, who's going to be the initial point to get it started? So that's what you got with here. Renaissance humanism is one of the phrases. That's the one where they did a lot of the literature and revised this literature and the art. He is big on the humanities, which a lot of humanists can learn from. Paul Kurt does have a section on the humanities too, but Corliss does a better job with it. So now we have that. Now let me see. Now the rest of the table of contents, you look, you'll see how he deals with. Gotta find it. Got so many introductions here because there's so many people wanted to admire him. He was.
Somebody named Beth Lamont.
What?
Somebody named Beth Lamont or something. Someone named Beth Lamont.
Well, that'll come up, yeah.
She was talking about degenderizing it.
Oh,
So
okay.
we didn't have
Yeah.
mankind, we have humankind.
All right. So you have these backgrounds, okay, so that it's important to know some of the history. When I talk to newer, younger Unitarian Universalists, and I realize that humanism came from the Unitarians in the first manifesto, a bunch of ministers. They say, really? Because a lot of Unitarian Universalists are sort of like neo-Buddhist, neo-pagan, and they have a cross-section of that. But the national leadership has a strong humanist flavor. The former president of the Unitarian Universal Association was Humanist of the Year in 2000, Bill Schultz. And he was an important leader. So, again, he honors these different traditions.
Mead Theological Seminary was the hotbed
Oh yeah, for the humanists, sure.
for the humanists.
Yeah,
They
and
were-
that was...
The more they learned about the underpinnings of religion, the more they began to say, hey, it looks like we humans are on our own.
Yeah, but the problem, of course, is as time went by, other parts of Unitarian Universalism brought in. They wanted, see, the Universalist tradition was everybody's okay. I'm okay, everybody's okay. So that meant Christian was still okay. Liberal Christians were very much involved. People like Congregationalists and Liberal Methodists were very involved with that. And of course, humanistic Judaism was a big deal. They had Jewish people. We had a speaker here. Yeah, that type of thinking. So you had that. So these traditions were very much supported. So the life is, now then he gets into the metaphysics, and the two next chapters, the life is all or none. In other words, if we are naturalistic or materialistic, this is it. There's no evidence that there's some transcendent existence beyond this material thing we live in. So he does that part of it by the unity of body and personality. The argument over what's this thing called the soul? Well, the soul, according to Plato, was the kind of soul that dies and goes to heaven. But in Aristotle's soul, no. When your body dies, the soul dies too. So he's closer to that one. So the idea is that this consciousness and this ability to do this abstract thinking goes beyond the grave for Plato, but not for Aristotle. It's done. And Corliss Lamont reinforces that. So the theory of the universe, of course, you look at the study of space and stuff like that, and you see that you use naturalistic sources, you use the scientific method, and he'll take us through it. So that's, now you notice when you talk about the nature of the universe, he's still telling us what we believe it's like. So then we got to move on to how we find out. So the next one, chapter 5, how do we seek knowledge? And he has a wonderful summary of ways that people, we can even take a look at that, 208, the use of reason. Let me see, 208. I like that because there is different arguments, and of course one of the favorite arguments for very believers is divine revelation, right? They accept the preaching of either scriptures or authoritative figures, divine revelation, which is one of the ways that he thinks it's not a great way to know about the nature of the universe. 5 chief ways. What else do they have? Authority. Now, what authority do we have? Now, authority could be the Bible, of Scripture. It could be a theological leader, priest, a minister, whatever, a rabbi. So that's how. Then there's intuition. You sit there and you say, I got it. Well, that has 2 roles. I hope I'll emphasize in a minute. But right now, intuition as an argument, is it a source of knowledge? Yeah, put a question mark around knowledge for a second. Then you have rationalism, the use of reason. But reason, where and how? Can you just use logic in total isolation with nothing else that's related to it? Like Rene Descartes tried to say, well, if you, oh yeah, keep the whistle wet. If you just say, well, the use of reason is wonderful, and he claimed that he can just use pure reason without looking at a bit of hardware anywhere and learn about the universe. And he kept doubting until he got down to almost nothing. And Corliss Lamont said, yeah, but where is the real world? Where is this stuff? So then he said, well, rationalism works fine if you apply it to a scientific approach or to the use of the world around you. And so he says scientific method. I like to use a phrase that is an informal version of scientific method. It's called empirical inferential. Every day. In other words, every day when we solve problems, we don't go through the whole formal steps of the scientific method. What we often do is we look around us and use our senses, and we form inferences if we don't see the direct evidence. I tell the story every time I do this. I have a mailbox in the front of my house, right? And I could look out to see that the mailbox is there. That morning, if I put a letter in the mailbox, I put the flag up, right? If I look out at noon, the flag's still up. No delivery yet, right? But at 2:30, the flag's down. I form an inference, right? Oh, the mailman went by. This is done so often in our life. That is a kind of a shortcut scientific, if you wish, method. I call it the inferential empirical, meaning the use of the senses, inferential use of thought process. So that's a short version of a formalized scientific method. He doesn't quite get into that. I think Paul Kurtz touched on that a little bit. But the idea, empiricism, is what most of our life depends on. The sounds, we hear them, the visual, the tactile, whatever. That's why sometimes if we have a hearing problem, well, we better depend on other senses, right? And people do that. So we are looking at that. Right now we can hear a sound out there. Now if we hear a loud sound and a whistling, oh, there's probably an emergency somewhere. You see, this is what a lot of what we do. So the idea of learning and thinking, finding out about the universe, our local one, and then we were talking about before, how do we know something, right? Well, depending on other people's witnesses can be a challenge, right? So how do we determine? Now there's another form of authority, not divine one, but two things, if you have an expert in a field and they relate to their subject, you have pretty good confidence that, like my scientist friend, will have a pretty good idea of what he's talking about. That is kind of a advisory leadership. And the other one is if you know a person is honest and dependable. You have those two things. So you have that kind of authority, but you got to believe people and wondering about their track record. So he does a pretty good job of going through these 5 ways of seeking knowledge. And you go through it again, and as I say, the only thing I would highlight is when he says science, we have our shortcut version of it, in my opinion. It's just almost the same. Okay, so after you do that, he gets to values, right? He's going to talk about how do we arrive at values. Well, I'll tell you what I like to do now. We have Manifesto 3. Did you guys get a copy of Humanism and Aspirations? Not aspirants, aspirations.
You've got 1 and 2. And
Yeah, I'm doing 3 because 3 is the most concise.
Yeah, in the folder there, we can read it.
Yeah, all right, well, I had my copy here, all right.
All right.
Where did I put my copy? All right, at any rate, what it does, it looks like a little bit like the table of contents. Let me see if I remember where I put my copy of that.
But that's the whole thing right there, honey.
Okay, yeah, but I thought I had my copy. Okay. The idea here is that, no, this is, yeah, 3, yeah. The idea is that, I like the concise, highlighted version, the one that Fred Edwards gave me. Let me see if I have it here. It's a tiny little one, my little, You know why? Because this,
Oh my gosh!
yeah, when I submitted a letter after Manifesto 3, 2003, when you have a letter published, they send you these things, and I've been handing them out since 2003. So, knowledge of the world is derived from observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. Similarity to what we just said. 2, humans are an integral part of nature, the result of unguided evolutionary change. All right? Evolution. Great stuff. Ethical values, here we go, are derived from human needs and interests as tested by experience. No divine revelation. I relate, I interact. Life's fulfillment. Now, once you've done that, life's fulfillment emerges from individual participation in the service of humane ideals. Now, think about it. We made a brief mention of mattering, just in informal conversation. Well, how do you matter? You matter by being involved in humane activity. Whether you work in a soup kitchen, whether you we did the climate change march, all 400,000 of us that day, right? Humane endeavors and activities. So we get, our life has meaning just by doing that stuff. Notice, humans are social by nature. They're social beings and find meaning in relationships. Now we're sitting here. Well, we could have sat home and read this, right? Just never mind. I'll just sit home and I'll just read it, right? But why are we here? You notice I like to greet and meet people. It's fun. It's not even being a good person. It's a fun thing to do. And this is pretty much what happens here.
It's also an affirmation. In other words, if you're home alone, you're not necessarily receiving a yes vote from anyone else, right? Whereas if you're in a group of like-minded people, sometimes you like preaching to the choir. You need to preach to the choir because you need the choir. You need to be surrounded by it.
Thank you for that, yeah. Right, and then the last one, and this one is working to benefit society maximizes your own happiness. I love working in the soup kitchen. I don't do it as much now because I'm not strong enough to lift the big old tables that we had to set up. So I give them money, and the argument is, well, what's the matter? You're going to throw money at the problem? And the woman who's in charge says, yeah, thank you, keep throwing it. So, you give where you can, and it still has meaning, and I do know that a lot of the people who come through there get additional counseling. Now, there's a lot of mental illness. Oh, man, a lot of mental illness. Now, I'll bet you a high percentage of the people who need soup kitchens and other housing, Coalition for the Homeless in New York is a big deal that has some of that.